Glory to Jesus Christ. We're going to continue our deacon series with the historic decline of the diaconate. And first, we're going to look primarily at St. Jerome and St. John Chrysostom. So we're getting towards the end of the golden age of the Apostolic Church and the diaconate. It wasn't until the 4th and 5th centuries, specifically, I'll lead off with what was happening in the West with St. Jerome, that this understanding of the diaconate began to be challenged via this emerging theory of presbyteral synonymy with the bishop's position, right? Nobody was arguing against the fact that there are three offices. All right, so let's think in historical context here. But there were some challenges with the distribution of this authority. So leading off with St. Jerome, in the 4th century, a subtle turn started to take place. St. Jerome, weary of the deacons' misuse of power and perceived excessive respect and authority, was really a driving agent in the realignment of power amongst the clergy. Again, it's a harsh way to put it, a realignment of power, provided these offices are in non-competition with one another, but sin is real, right? And there was excessive abuses by especially the archdeacons in Rome, right? So St. Jerome is addressing this power issue amongst the Roman archdeacons. So it wasn't something going after the office of the diaconate in general, okay? But really pointing out an issue, okay? And it wasn't, if you read St. Jerome, it wasn't necessarily driving towards this objective idea of the priest being equal with the bishop, right? Although he does say some things that may be interpreted that way, but it's primarily just putting the deacons, the archdeacons in Rome, in their place, so to speak. A lot of things were happening at that point. For example, deacons receiving communion before the priests, the patriarchs being drawn directly from the diaconate, etc., etc. So this counter of priestly sacerdotalism is starting to take place. So when I use that word sacerdote, it's merely going to be used in terms of wielding presbyteral sacramental authority and honor as a functional position against the excess power of deacons. Okay, there's many ways in which this is used. This term is used, but just to hone it in, it's simply in the context, in this historical context, as it relates to diaconal authority. Certain figures seem to imply or posit greater synonymy rather than partial synonymy regarding especially in the contemporary church. But again, just reiterating that this is in the historical context of the distinction between deacon, presbyter, and bishop, and their position, office, honor, and authority, both in function or the economy of the church, as well as in essence or ousia, or what they are substantially by their office, right? So sacerdotalism is defined as emphasizing the power of presbyters as essential mediators, right? In this context, they're using essential as in a way that is attacking the over extension of power of the diaconate. So St. Jerome, when he's making his case, like I said, may not have in mind all deacons, but rather the highly powerful and influential archdeacons in Rome. So St. Jerome was not misplaced in his objections. And as we already noted by St. Cyprian in his work on the lapsed, it's important for the deacon to know his place and his role, okay? Because there was a lot of abuse of those roles. However, St. Jerome points out that the honor given to presbyters by their sacramental authority is cause for reducing this diaconal power or reinverting it, to its proper honorary structure, which we've already established as true, right? It just went a little bit too far. And frankly, a lot of these things that went too far happened well after St. Jerome. So St. Jerome couldn't have possibly known all the implications of what he was addressing. So in complete fairness to him, I think that's fair. He was addressing what was in front of him, and that was in fact abuses by a number of deacons. So it was a neutral sense that St. Jerome is operating out of that is historically isolated. All right, how that evolved later in the church we'll get to in the history video that will come a little bit later. So this implied, when he goes as far as noting that presbyters were the true successors of Jewish sons of Aaron and that deacons were Levites, okay, so reaffirming that connection, and that they're inferior to priests, okay, and were to be promoted to priesthood. So he's also going as far as promoting this idea of the diaconate being a transitional office only, right? He doesn't exclude the permanency of it, but he says, hey, if we're treating this as a transitional office in the central sees in a lot of ways, then why are we not doing that across the board, right? That's what I gleaned out of that. Anyways, the first instance of the synonymy began kind of inverting this understanding of holy orders to where historically you have, and this is affirmed by the church today, you have the priest and bishop proceeding, or the priest and deacon proceeding out of the bishop. This concept introduced this visual of that being inverted, right? Lowering the diaconal office and subsequently creating a greater synonymy between priest and bishop. Okay. Saint Cyprian, okay, about deacons being provided too much power on being seen as more precious than presbyters. His negatively oriented and pro-sacerdotal polemics, polemics is probably a strong word. This is not from St. Cyprian, this is from Jerome, tended to go beyond the necessity and were, in many cases, just his opinion and not doctrine. All right, albeit just an opinion, it is the root of much confusion on the diaconate in subsequent centuries, right? St. John Chrysostom, on the other hand, also emphasized this sacerdotalism, but in a more positive sense. It was not at the expense of the diaconal office, right? He valued the diaconate as a permanent fixture in the life of the church. That is to say, he didn't do anything with a negative orientation, right? He wasn't combating a negative, like Jerome was with the archdeacons in Rome. St. John Chrysostom was correct in noting that the presbyter and the deacons do have far greater similarity, provided the deacon does not possess a wide spectrum of sacramental faculties. However, he did believe deacons, while valuable and respected office, directing ministry, were to hopefully desire advancement to a higher degree, i.e. to the priesthood, as a testament to their success as deacons. Okay, great priests often are just as great, if not even greater, deacons, right? There's a lot of value in that modus, and you have to ask yourself, it's like, gosh, in the modern church, if you have seminarians that basically are deacons for 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, are they really understanding what the diaconal office is? And are they losing aspects of their diaconia due to a limited exposure over time before they become priests? I would say yes. I would say that's a huge problem in the church. But I'll leave that opinion to you. All this is to say, a good deacon can reasonably aspire to the presbyteral office as a matter of service and sharing God's gift to the people of God. St. John Chrysostom demonstrates the superiority in honor of the presbyter being the dispenser of the holy mysteries, but also implicitly elevates the gifts of the deacon and how it's foundational to being a good presbyter. You really see two sides of the picture, Jerome and Chrysostom, West and East, starting to take root in the 4th and 5th centuries of the church, right? And this is where we could say generally where we're starting to see this decline that's going to take place over multiple centuries. So with the excesses of inappropriate diaconal power and abuses among the 7 deacons of Rome, the diaconate began to fall victim to a lot of other historical circumstances as well. Over time, the church was expanding, forcing an overabundance of deacons to be elevated in the presbyterate to serve communities sacramentally, which did diminish diaconal volume. So the church has to be cautious on how many men it draws out of the diaconate for presbyteral service. Otherwise, it just empties out the diaconal ministry. Over time, these were innovative notions, okay, but eventually it transitioned into, no pun intended, transitioned into a transitional only diaconate in the West, right? Which organically reinforced this synonymy of bishop and presbyter theory over time, as that's just what people saw. There were just bishops and priests, and then all the deacons were hidden away in seminaries, really robbing the people of the necessity of that diaconal ministry at the parish level. These historical circumstances garnered great emphasis on the presbyterate, while subsequently reducing the diaconate, which led to a diminishing ministry in some areas, and eventually, as the centuries passed, to a full-scale relegation of the diaconate to a visibly subordinate and transitional order, at least in the West, right? The East had its issues too, but it wasn't as pronounced. As the trajectory of the declining diaconate took shape in the latter half of the first millennium, the historic development shows that the emissary preaching, teaching, and charitable roles of the diaconate were also subsequently greatly diminished. The deacon in the Middle Ages, in the Western Church specifically, devolved fully into a transitional role. Okay, so here we are 500-600 years later, we're fully in a transitional role that emphasized and embodying a near presbyteral and episcopal synonymy in practice, okay, but not in doctrine. But in practice, that's what was happening. While the transitional diaconate in the Latin Church was not a term utilized in the East, the Orthodox Church saw a similar reductive paradigm that resulted in a diaconate expressed mostly as a liturgical ornament, often sought for effective singing because they could chant really well, but maybe their formation was very poor. I would say that wasn't specific to the diaconate. I would say formation was very poor across the board at that time. But both East and West in the second millennium saw a loss of how the diaconate was ministerially expressed in liturgy, preaching, and charity in the fullness of its apostolicity. As the church grew in the West through the Renaissance, the Roman clergy became synonymous also with clerical celibacy. The product of this in the Western Church is the opinion, okay, and the practice, but not the doctrine, that celibacy is ontologically correlated with the presbyterate. With no permanent fixture of deacons, this led many to either unknowingly assume or knowingly presume celibacy is directly and ontologically connected with the sacrament of holy orders and the clerical state in general, to include the diaconate. Well, that's just not true, right? You could be married clergy, you could be married deacon, you could be married priest. It's just a practice in the Roman Church to have a celibate priesthood, right? And I'm just not, it's not worth going down that rabbit hole on whether that's a good, neutral, or bad thing for the West. The East and the West are just two entirely different cultures, to where a married priesthood and diaconate is very fitting of the Byzantine Church. And reasonable arguments can be made in the Western Church that keeps celibacy as the norm for priests. But these theological opinions, rooted in this sacerdotal bias of the Latin Church in the Middle Ages, at least in practice and not doctrine, put any concept of the restoration of the diaconate at a disadvantage when it came to the Latin Church's understanding of the essentiality, equality, and authority of the deacon heading into the Protestant Reformation. This led to issues of practical and theological understanding regarding the necessity of the deacon, the Christological essence of the office, and the diaconate's essential mission in the church and world. So by the 16th century, the reformers rejected the notion of the deacon and eliminated the office outright. They had no good example from the church, amongst many other things, at the time. So it makes sense that they just nixed that office. At a similar time, some of the Roman Catholic leaders at the Council of Trent, Counter-Reformation Council, sought to restore the apostolic diaconate. However, it was met with great resistance due to a lack of understanding of the office and a fear of the power the deacon might wield again. So ultimately, those proposals failed. So fast forward. I guess I should have clicked the slides here. Fast forward. By the 19th century, the Reformed theologians, seeking to be more biblically sound, could not reject the diaconate outright, given its clear scriptural foundation. However, in doing so, they sought to restore the diaconate by redeeming the service element alone due to a mistranslation of Acts chapter 6. We had already touched on this in the Acts 6 video. So now we're getting to that. So beginning in the 19th century, German leaders began to advocate for the restoration of the diaconate as a full and proper order that created a new fervor for the idea of the diaconate, first within the boundaries of the liturgical churches and in time through the various Christian communities that were non-liturgical. This was primarily prompted by the German Lutherans adopting a specific mission towards service to the poor, the needy, destitute, and disabled. Okay. This type of work for the sick, neglected, poor, and imprisoned was in great need in certain areas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So they began to develop a theology not of rejecting deacons entirely, as was the approach of the original reformers, but centered around a new directive that deployed deacons in an entirely servile role to fill the social service needs while simultaneously disregarding the liturgical and preaching ministries of the deacon. So they cherry-picked the diaconate for their particular needs. In essence, the theology of the understanding began to shift now as well, in addition to previously identified historical misunderstandings. So, inspired wrongly by a contextual misunderstanding of Acts 6 as table servers and food distributors, which is false, the deacons of the Lutheran communities in Germany were made in the image of the 7, quote, servers, end quote, who only serve the poor. Before long, as you can imagine, the term diaconia or diaconie developed in Germany in the common language as synonymous with the social work and social service of the area. And the deacons began being understood as particularly synonymous with ecclesial social workers. So as you could picture this enormous divergence of understanding has happened, right? In the Roman Church, you have this distinction between the priests and bishops and the transitional diaconate. And in the Protestant churches, you have one aspect of the trifold ministry emphasized as the primary and relegating the other two to non-usage. So this, the Protestants believed, was a correction to the ornamental Byzantine deacon in a lot of ways, as well as that transitional diaconate of the Roman Catholic. So unfortunately, it didn't consider the emissary trifold ministry of the apostolic diaconate. Nobody did. Roman Catholics, Byzantine Catholics, or the Protestants. Everyone missing the mark, frankly. So before long, the new innovative vernacular understanding was spread among the other Protestant communities throughout Europe, as well as America, right? So according to the research at the time furnished by the Germans, the understanding of diaconia had changed significantly from the biblical definition. It was solely that of self-giving service to the poor and marginalized, right? Ecclesiastical social workers, so to speak. This definition was popularized by biblical scholar Wilhelm Brandt in 1931. Brandt defined the term diaconia as a plain helping activity or a social service of love rendered to neighbor and community alone. This understanding received full academic support when his linguistic understanding was listed in Gerhard Kittel's highly influential work, The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, just a few years later in 1935. The subsequent publications accepted this definition with very little resistance, even among many contemporary publications, and it quickly became a lived, experiential, and pastoral status quo, so to speak, of what the deacon was and how it's to be understood. This portrayed the deacon in the function of a social worker and not an emissary agent in the trifold ministry. So it's important to note that this definition is not in keeping with modern scholarship on diaconia, nor the ancient understanding. However, his initial work influenced subsequent works, mistranslating diaconia throughout the early and mid 20th century at a pivotal time, honestly, as the diaconate was about to be reintroduced into Western Catholicism. So John N. Collins notes that, quote, care, concern, and love, those elements of meaning introduced into the interpretation of this word and its cognates by Wilhelm Brandt, are simply just not part of their field of meaning. He follows that the early Christians would not understand why their modern counterparts have so restricted the ministry of the ancient world and the office of the diaconate, that it now applies only to the caregiving sphere of the Christian life. So, as noted, after the summary of Acts 6, a proper understanding of who and what a deacon is necessitates a proper understanding of what diaconia means, emissary. Here the Western churches, in many ways, to include just all Western churches, including the Roman Church, has the beginning of the inversion of definitions that began a cascade of misunderstanding and misattribution of who and what the deacon is, as it continued to transition from emissary servant agent to a social welfare agent. So in doing so, it redefined diaconia as a social agency and not an emissary trifold minister in the image of Christ. Okay, so at this time, you had the same word and they would have meant two totally different things. It would have been such a foreign concept to the apostolic church to see this definition of the deacon. So this polarization created an ecclesiastical environment ripe for potential misunderstanding by both Eastern and Western theologians, even though this understanding of diaconia was largely rendered inadequate and inaccurate by the mid 20th century. So, but right around that time is when the Roman Catholic Church had the Second Vatican Council. And right around that time, much of the contemporary research done on theological circles on the diaconate was furnished by these German Lutherans, who now set forth to develop their own universally understood formal definition of the diaconate and pastoral ministry rather than just a vernacular understanding of diaconia at the local levels, right? So there was a runaway train of the wrong definition and understanding of diaconia that had a cascading effect on the office itself, conveniently right before the church reinstitutes the diaconate. So much of this new diaconal theology found its lasting identity in how the term diaconia was interpreted after the council. And by the mid 20th century, the Latin Catholics saw the timing as opportune, to restore the order of deacons as a permanent fixture in the church. It had been known that the restoration was essentially necessary because there was a shortage of deacons. Good for the church, right? There was and still is a shortage of deacons. Not because there's a shortage of presbyters. But again, having more deacons, force multiplier, you're going to have more presbyters. All right? In the Dogmatic Constitution Lumen Gentium, the call for the restoration of the diaconate in the Latin ritual church as a proper and permanent rank in the hierarchy was put forth. And at the close of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI stated, quote, "We stress that the teaching of the Council is channeled in one direction, the service of humankind in every condition and every weakness and need. The Church has declared herself as a servant of humanity at the very time when her teaching role and her pastoral governance have, has have, because of this church solemnity assumed greater splendor and vigor. However, the idea of service has to be central. Okay, this closing statement is especially telling the diaconate's role in the modern world. At the core of Vatican II is service, not merely social service, but rather diaconia, to affirm and remind Christians that the church is of service as Christ served. That is, the mission of diaconia and the embodiment of the mission is found in the deacon, the icon of Christ through his service in the trifold ministry, liturgy, word, and charity. Okay, it only took a couple years for this to culminate in a formal restoration in 1967 by Pope Paul VI for the permanent diaconate, but unfortunately the Roman Catholic Church did not have a full grasp of how to institute the deacon in the modern world, and borrowed in practice, not in doctrine, some ill-formulated Protestant research that had permeated Western thought at the time. Even though it was thoroughly disproved, which I already said, this wove its way into the common understanding and orthopraxis of both the Roman and Byzantine communities in the Western world, more so in the Roman world, less so in the Byzantine world, but still you see some carryover there. This mischaracterization and misunderstanding created an ill-serving ambiguity in the office, which left too much room for misunderstanding, and due to this lack of understanding and due to this catch-all ministerial office of the deacon, this ambiguity compounded over time and created an insufficient theology of the diaconate that took root in the traditions of East and West in different ways. One emphasized social roles in praxis in the Roman Church while retaining a clear trifold image in its doctrine, and the other, still retaining that trifold doctrine, keeps the office a little more one-dimensional in liturgy and preaching while not nurturing the positive, charitable, and servile elements of the office. This is a overgeneralization, obviously. Some dioceses and eparchies have very good diaconal formation, and there's a lot of wonderful deacons out there that really embody the trifold ministry. But at scale, you see a lot of inconsistencies here, right? You'll see a lot of Roman deacons that are either refused, or maybe they're not even permitted to wear clerical attire. Maybe they have a little lapel pin, or like I said, they see it as an extra office, not an essential office. So it becomes this role for older retired men. Okay, and that's just not what the diaconate is, right? Or you'll see oftentimes the deacon doing liturgical functions and absolutely doing nothing in service of the community, and spending the zero time and effort bringing people back to the altar. Okay, you have East and West tradition. When taken together, you see the fullness of the apostolic diaconate. Okay, we have a great opportunity. Okay, while both the East and West are doctrinally clear on the diaconate, albeit different expressions, the lived tradition of both concerning the diaconate is missing the mark in some way. Okay, what they can do, seen together, is show that apostolic diaconate in full and learn from one another. And this will create a new springtime for diaconia, I'm convinced of it, at scale, to serve the people of God, and of course beyond, and bring people back to the church. Okay, church needs good men. Contact your vocations director. Inquire about the diaconate or minor orders or seminary, but provided this is about the diaconate, don't be shy. Get out there, reach out. You reaching out to your vocations director or talking to your priest or pastor about it does not oblige you to do anything. It's just starting a conversation and seeing how, and it might open more doorways for you to see different ways that you contribute to your church community, right? All the churches need good men taking leadership positions, not just within their families, but within their communities and the church at large. So reach out and have a conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at wacobyzantine@gmail.com and visit us on wacobyzantine.com. Shameless plug, awesome website, has some good info on it. Definitely connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and of course subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next video will be either one video or 3 videos on the trifold ministry of the deacon, and maybe some challenges in the contemporary world that we're facing in the practice of the deacon in the 21st century. All right, till next time, God bless. Bye.